I wish to welcome everyone on this online discussion. We hold such discussions at the Institute for Policy Reforms periodically and usually on topics of interest to Pakistan, to the region, and to the world. So I'd like to welcome everybody who has joined us today, and I acknowledge the very honorable speakers, Ambassador Riaz Mohammed Khan, General Ashfaq, and a good friend who has participated in IPR events on numerous occasions, Dr. Anatol Lieven. So today's discussion is titled New Developments in Afghanistan, Challenges and Opportunities for Pakistan. And we will today try and discuss the recent developments, which we are all aware of, and what possibly lies ahead in the region. I was looking at the recent history of Afghanistan, and it seems to go in approximately 50-year cycles. The first 50-year cycle is around close to 40, actually. King Zahir Shah's reign ended in 1973 when Dawood did the coup. And the period that started very tumultuous period since 1973, which seems to be ending now. And so today we sit and we try and figure out what the next 50-year half-century cycle may perhaps look like. We are very concerned in Pakistan. It's particularly urgent for us because we would be directly affected by how events unfold there. I mean, we all know it's very fluid right now. I mean, the evacuation is taking place and will continue for the next few days. And it will be weeks, if not months, before we see the could potentially bring about a period of stability and order after years of tumult and tragedy. And after August 31st, I think the whole world would be watching if there is an agreed governing arrangement between the Pashtun Taliban and other Afghan communities. And I think that a Taliban
I lose you, Humayun Akhtar Saab.
Imminent terror threat. We just saw a horrendous explosion resulting in many losses of lives. And very definitely, terrorist organizations are trying to move in and use the uncertainty of transition to assert their presence and pose a threat to stability. I think everyone realizes, and I hope that the Taliban realize, that the Afghan society has changed in the last 20 years. While there may be setbacks, and a lot of criticism is going towards the United States and NATO and all that about the training of the Afghan army, but you know, there has been a massive infrastructure development in Afghanistan. Energy sector has developed, education sector has developed, number of universities have come up, IT infrastructure is well established. So the Afghan population, a major chunk of which is very young, are very IT savvy and are very well aware of what's happening in the region. So the other thing we have to see is that this vacuum that has been created by the American and the NATO withdrawal, what is the reaction of some regional countries? Would they try and take advantage of the uncertainties? That's one question. Very definitely, Afghanistan will need economic help and connectivity to the rest of the world. And therefore, the cooperation of the international community is required. And we think that the Taliban realized that. But that would only be forthcoming if, in turn, Kabul assuages the anxieties and concerns of the international community. So overall, as of now, it's not all gloom and doom. The Taliban are saying the right things, and they have promised to not govern with the same rigidity and severity as they did until 2001. There seems to be a collective leadership coming up, contrary to what the situation was when they were in power since the late 90s. However, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar seems to be the lead decision maker within this collective setup. So the real question for us is how all this would affect Pakistan. That's why we gathered this afternoon. And so our first concern, and that's the concern for many other countries in the world, is whether Taliban will allow or will be able to control Afghan soil by being used as a terror base by various organizations. That's Pakistan's concern. There is the TTP, which we are very concerned about, and China is concerned. The Western countries are concerned. Our economic stakes are also very high. We are very aware of if there's peace, the economic dividends that this peace will bring, not only in Afghanistan and Central Asia, but also in Pakistan. Fortunately, contrary to past fears, so far there has been no civil war or bloodshed, barring the suicide bombing at the airport. And today we have an extremely illustrious panel. Couldn't be a better panel to discuss some of these concerns with us. And so this afternoon and this morning, I think Anatol is in England, so morning there. So let's try and figure out, if we can, what the next half-century cycle in Afghanistan may look like. With that, I'd like to invite our first speaker, which is Ambassador Riaz Muhammad Khan. He's Pakistan's distinguished diplomat with about 40 years of foreign service experience. Riaz Khan Sahib's rich career includes assignments as ambassador to Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyz Republic, the European Union, and to the People's Republic of China. He was also Foreign Secretary, where in addition to overseeing all bilateral and multilateral relations, he led the Pakistan delegation to the Pak-India Composite Dialogue, the Pakistan-US Strategic Dialogue, and to the United Nations General Assembly. Equally, Ambassador Khan was engaged with multilateral matters, serving in Pakistan's mission to the United Nations in New York and at ministry in Islamabad, overseeing relations with international organizations, including on the sensitive issue of arms control. On a sabbatical from service, he was diplomat in residence at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He was also a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Riaz Khan Saab frequently writes for national and international publications and has written two well-researched books, Untying the Afghan Knot, Negotiating the Soviet Withdrawal, and Afghanistan and Pakistan, Conflict, Extremism, and Resistance to Modernity, both germane to the topic under discussion. It is a pleasure to request Ambassador Khan to the virtual podium. Ambassador Saab.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Humayun Akhtar Sahib, Professor Anatol, my very distinguished friends, Faqir Ejazuddin Sahab, I see, Tariq Ikram Sahab, I see, Hussain Naqi Sahab, I see. So thank you very much for this opportunity to start the discussion. I'll be rather brief because, as I mentioned earlier, I am not really feeling that well. I am under this new pandemic attack. But I'll try to just focus on urgent issues, challenges that you have mentioned. There would be many analyses, I think, for months, if not years on ends, what happened. There has been much already written about it. But let me start with a couple of comments, general comments. First of all, this is a time when we have to pay tribute to the Taliban, who have accomplished something very remarkable. And this is their valor, this is their grit, this is their faith with which they have accomplished this. And to detract from it, that they have been proxies of Pakistan or they have been this or that, I think is both unfair and not right. So the first point is this. Second point is that the Afghan story has not come to an end. It will continue. One hopes that this is not a false dawn again. Humayun Sahab have mentioned about 40-year cycle, but whatever cycles, we have seen that there were opportunities in the past, they were lost. There is also talk about whether the United States has suffered a setback or it's a defeat or whatever it is. I think that too is not it's a rather misplaced kind of a discussion in my view. Great powers have their own rhythm, and their systems. They determine direction of things in the world. I remember about 40 or maybe more than that, United States suffered a setback in Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is the largest Southeast Asian partner, trading partner with the United States. Remember about, I think, 30 years ago, Soviet Union, Russia, they suffered a setback in Afghanistan. Today, along with China, Russia and China, they are basically the operators, they are the movers and shakers in the heartland of Asia. So the great powers have their own rhythm. We don't have to get into that. There would be a lot of analysis about this. The focus that I would have is that now, as I said, that there are many challenges for the Taliban. Uh, there are adversaries, internal, external. They are untested in so far as governance is concerned. There has been hardly any tradition of reconciliation and modern governance in Afghanistan. So there are those kinds of challenges. There is the challenge of formation of a government, etc., stability, peace, all that. So with all these challenges, I would say there are also some hopeful signs, some hopeful signs. First and foremost, and I think Himayu Saab, you have also mentioned about this, have the Taliban changed? There are indications that there are changes. They have learned something over these 20 years or so. They have been remarkably disciplined so far, so far. So this is, in my view, something positive. Regardless of all that has appeared in the Western press elsewhere, you know, about doubts about the Taliban and what they are and what they are not. I would say the fact that if that is true, I think it's true, that Bill Burns had met Mullah Brother, that the statements which are coming from President Biden are guarded. They are not, attacking the Taliban. The fact that there was this terrible, terrible suicide bombing, and in that aftermath of that, there have been some modicum of the cooperation or at least coordination at the airport between the two sides. The fact that there is some movement, as it appears, for some kind of a arrangement for governance, they are all very positive. But yet, we cannot ignore that the world press is roiled away, roiled, and the human rights groups, the women's groups, all those. So there are challenges for the Taliban. Now, I come basically to my point that what is it that is urgent? What is it that the immediate challenge? Because I don't want to go into the analyses of these things. In my view, the first and foremost challenge for the Afghans and for the international community is to avert a civil war. That would be a great tragedy if that happens, if that is allowed to happen. This is a great challenge for the Afghans themselves, the Afghan leadership. They have to see to it that they do not let down the Afghan nation at this juncture. There is an opportunity. Secondly, for countries in the region, outside the region, countries like Pakistan, we have to give the Taliban and the Afghans space so that they can work out things among themselves. We should not be giving unsolicited advice, but if it is sought, then certainly that advice should be given, but we should not be giving unsolicited advice to the Afghans. Afghans have their own institutions, Afghans know, and they seem to be moving in the right direction. So first, we give them space. Secondly, diplomacy, bilateral, international, but discreet diplomacy. Discreet diplomacy for the purpose, as I mentioned, to avert that there is no return of civil war in Afghanistan. The situation moves towards stabilization, and if in a discreet manner we can help matters towards stability and peace, we should do that. For Pakistan in particular, we need to coordinate with a number of countries around the world, starting with China, Russia, United States, the Central Asian republics, Iran, Turkey, the Saudi Arabia, etc., all that. So we have to do it, but we have to, as I said, that the key is that we should not be pushing, we should not be seeking roles, but we should be pushing things with a certain discretion. Then, apart from that, I would say that yes, in terms of immediate policy, one very important aspect of this international effort is humanitarian assistance. Afghans need all kinds of humanitarian assistance. We have to see that the situation does not generate the kind of migrations and refugees and chaos which had generated in the past. So that is one other. Here, international community, the World Food Program, the United Nations, other agencies, even OIC, others have a role. Afghans at this juncture, they need our help, and that help should be. There should be all kinds of facilitation for the Afghans where Pakistan has a certain important role because of the geography, because of all the factors that are there on the ground. So this is one other aspect I would want to have, to highlight. Then I would say that initiatives for Pakistan. There is among diplomats sometimes a proclivity that we should be very active, we should be proactive, we should be having conferences, we should organize this, we should organize that. I am a bit, I should say, I have my skepticism about these things. Pakistan should not be trying to have gatherings in Islamabad or trying to have any conferences. We should be active. I am not saying that we should be bystanders. We should be active, reaching out to others. If there is a potent initiative, then certainly we should participate in that. And for that potent initiative, I have said that our partners are in the region, outside the region. I have identified so many countries. So if there is a potent initiative towards peace, towards stability, etc., towards helping the Afghans, that we need to do that. But on our own, we should not be organizing things in Pakistan. We should be careful about that. Then I have mentioned about the humanitarian issues. Yeah, we have, of course, a history of our relations with Afghanistan, and there have been many suspicions, and there have been many problems, and there have been many issues. But this is not the time for us to burden the new government, which is still in the phase of formation, to be to push them on those kinds of issues. There is the border issue. On border issue, at least my mind is very clear. The border is the border, that is all. We have to accept it. I have written extensively about it, and we should not bother about that. It's a de facto border, that is it. Secondly, there is the issue of TTP, which is very important for us. We should not push it, but if there is a cause for concern, and already, this bombing has shown that TTP can be active, then we have to basically reach out to whoever, the Taliban government or any other arrangement, to be able to see that they should try to take care of that. But again, it's not a question of pushing. There has been also in the past, we have seen the question of Pakistan's concern about the Afghan soil being used against Pakistan, India's role, all that. Now, I think those things will come, but probably at a certain later stage. Hopefully, those kinds of situations will no longer occur, and they would get discouraged with the change of the circumstance in Afghanistan. But that is not an issue that we should be pursuing upfront with the new dispensation. Then we have seen that there is a lot of talk about opportunities. There's CPEC, there is the North-South corridors, trade, there are resources, there are all kinds of things that one finds in the press. Again, this is not the time. I think first Afghanistan has to stabilize itself. Once it is able to stabilize, then I think with all the potential that it has, it will be able to play a very important role for the region, for itself, and at that time we may have also many parts there are concerns. We must also recognize that India is a regional player. It cannot be wished away. It will be there. So we have to think about those things. And with that, I think I'll make my last point. And here I may be jumping the gun and infringing on what I already said earlier, that this may not be the time now. But at a certain stage, if the situation in Afghanistan settles down, hopefully it will, then at that stage, I think we should look at this development as a point of inflection for rethinking our regional role. And can it be refashioned? Can it be reviewed? But that is something which is for the future. So thank you very much. These are my just few observations. As I mentioned to you, I'm not in a position to get into any long discussion or analysis, but we will listen to other colleagues for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Riaz. We always count on your deep knowledge and insight. Thank you for taking the time. I hope you'll feel well enough to take a few questions in the end. Do give it a try.
I'll do that if needed.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Anatol Lieven, and he needs no introduction. He's a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. Dr. Lieven is a leading expert on global security policy, especially insurgency and terrorism. His engagement with the region began in the 1980s when he was South Asia correspondent for the Financial Times and the Times of London, from where he also covered the fighting in Afghanistan resulting from the Soviet invasion. He has written several books of high scholarship. Some of them have won awards and included in the New York Times Notable Books of the Year. As everyone knows, his book, Pakistan, A Hard Country, received wide praise in Pakistan and internationally. It is also required reading for US and UK diplomats assigned to South Asia. His most recent book is on climate control, Before joining the Quincy Institute, Dr. Lieven taught at Georgetown University's Qatar campus and King's College, London. His columns and articles are widely published in international journals. I especially recommend his recent paper on an Afghan tragedy, the Pashtuns, the Taliban, and the state. I know that there are many claimants on your time, Anatol. Thank you for being with us. You have the virtual floor, please. Anatol?
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking again to you, and in the company of Riaz Saab, one of Pakistan's greatest state servants, who's I think that there is a fairly good chance that the Taliban will establish stable and reasonably civilized government in Afghanistan, which would obviously be vastly to the good of Pakistan and the rest of the world as well. But as Riaz emphasized, there are also some dangers. The greatest danger, yes, is of civil war and ongoing chaos. And I would say that I can completely agree with Riaz Saab that Pakistan must not try to take the lead or be seen openly to putting pressure on the Taliban. I do think, however, that Pakistan, as part of the international community and as a regional power, must do its best to participate in, not necessarily to coordinate, but to help to shape regional consensuses on Afghanistan that will in fact bring influence to bear on the Taliban and other players, because after so many years of covering Afghanistan, I am considerably less optimistic about the ability of the Afghans, simply left to themselves, to work things out peacefully. That has certainly not been the pattern of the past 50 years in Afghanistan. Now, when it comes to Taliban behavior, the first point is that they must keep to their promises to prevent international terrorism based in Afghanistan. Now, fortunately, one aspect of that is very easy for the Taliban because they are enemies, but clearly, especially after the latest bombing, the Taliban must continue to take strong action against ISIS or Daesh in the Islamic State of Khorasan. Everybody expects that. Every single major country around the world expects the Taliban to, because ISIS, of course, are a threat to everybody, Pakistan included, since, as we know, so many members of ISIS in Khorasan are, in fact, Pakistani members of the TTP and affiliated groups who were driven into or fled into Afghanistan from the Pakistan army. So Pakistan has a legitimate case there. Not I think, so much for putting pressure on the Taliban, but certainly for helping the Taliban in this fight. And that is essential if the Taliban are going to receive international aid and support, not just from the West. The West, in the longer term, may play a very limited role in Afghanistan, but China, critically, and other states. Now, that brings me to the second point when it comes to the avoidance of civil war in Afghanistan, which is the Taliban's promises to when it comes to domestic policy. And these promises come in two forms. The first has been, about allowing a certain space of cultural freedom and women's education and so on. Now, sorry, I must sneeze. I'm so sorry. I also have a bad cold. This is essential if the Taliban are to have a chance of maintaining and building up some kind of modern state in Afghanistan. Because if all the Afghan technocrats flee, as so many of them are clearly trying to do at the moment, Afghanistan will simply lack the cadres that are necessary for modern state development and to allow any kind of, outside investment and to administer international aid. But of course, these people will only stay in Afghanistan if they are guaranteed, certain rights and freedoms, not so much political rights, but certainly cultural rights. But politically, of course, this will involve the Taliban continuing with what they have begun, which is serious talks with members of the former state or regime in Afghanistan, the more respectable elements, shall we say, like Ismail Khan from Herat, to include them in the new Taliban state and not to exclude them or persecute them, or God forbid, execute them. That has been helped by the fact that some of the nastiest ones, General Dostum and Atta Mohammed, have already fled abroad. But including people from the now fallen Afghan state will be critical, I think, to internal Afghan stability. And, of course, by the same token, respect for minority rights, and above all for Shia minority rights, the rights of the Hazara, which the Taliban have promised to Iran to do. And I do think that it is very important that Pakistan, make its own views on this very clear and sincere when it comes to Afghanistan. And let me be here completely frank, it is also extremely important from this point of view that Afghanistan should not yield to what may be some quite substantial bribes being offered by Saudi Arabia to try to turn Afghanistan into a base for Saudi pressure and sectarian attacks on the Shia and then on Iran. That would be fatal, because at that point we would risk going back to the 1990s, and you would have a situation in which Iran would have every motive to support an armed opposition to the Taliban within Afghanistan. At present, it seems to me the future of the opposition government formed by former Vice President Amanullah Saleh is highly questionable. Just as we've heard, Afghanistan is not the same country as it was before 2001. The Taliban are not the same Taliban, nor are the Panjshiri leadership. They've back in 2001, they were still a pretty tough lot. Well, they were still led by Ahmed Shah Massoud. They've spent 20 years now in offices and luxurious palaces in Kabul. I doubt that they have the same fighting spirit that they did 20 years ago, but it would still be very unwise, to neglect that threat or take it for granted. And to make sure that that does not emerge as a real Taliban government, or at least a real threat of civil war, it is essential that the Taliban respect their promises internally, but those have also been promises to international players as well. And here, when it comes to preventing outside support for opposition movements within Afghanistan, this means preventing international terrorism in general. In other words, not necessarily handing over members of groups like Al-Qaeda, because that is very difficult for Afghan culture, but certainly taking very firm, clear, overt measures to prevent any kind of external actions by these groups. But this must also involve prevention of terrorism. That may be more difficult. Of course, certain anti-Indian terrorist groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, have very close links to the Taliban, certainly to the Haqqani network, and have been very useful to them. Nonetheless, India has been totally taken by surprise more than everybody else, because it had not even tried previously to open negotiations with the Taliban over what has happened. But there are obviously very strong voices in Delhi calling for support for Saleh. Obviously, Raw has very close relations indeed with the NDS, which he headed. Now, given the speed of Taliban victory and the complete collapse of the Afghan state, there will also be, strong influence in Delhi for a cautious line. It is in everybody's interest, if we wish to see the stability of Afghanistan, that India should adopt a cautious line towards Afghanistan and not simply back the opposition to the Taliban. But if India sees Afghanistan becoming a base for anti-Indian terrorism, then India will support as best it can the anti-Taliban opposition, and that could have very, very sad consequences for Afghanistan. Then there is the question of the economic development of Afghanistan. Now, whether this can occur will also depend, of course, on peace, on the maintenance of peace, and therefore that there should not be a really strong armed opposition movement, that ISIS should be suppressed, and that the Taliban, as I've said, should pursue a process of relative internal openness and pragmatism. I would say pragmatism about the Taliban, not moderation. And because as we've seen over the past decade and more, China on paper has committed itself to enormous investments in Afghanistan, $3 billion to the Ainak copper mine alone, promised investments of hundreds of millions in energy in northern Afghanistan. It has done almost nothing because, of course, in the middle of a civil war, who would? This Chinese investment will, as well as international aid, will be critical to the economic development of Afghanistan and to creating a minimally decent life for ordinary Afghans, and therefore for the stability of the Afghan state, and therefore for the interests of Pakistan, that there should not be continued waves of refugees or migrants into Pakistan, and that Afghanistan should not be an area of chaos in which Pakistani militants can also flourish. So Pakistan has a very, very strong economic interest in helping to make Afghanistan the sort of place where international investment, which means first and foremost Chinese investment, can occur. And if it does, I think this will be very much in the interests of Pakistan, because this will also tie Afghanistan and Pakistan more closely together, not in terms of strategic depth and Pakistani political influence and all the things that Riaz Saab has quite rightly criticized in the past, but in terms of common economic interests, infrastructure, transport links, and so on. But just to repeat again, it is so important that Afghanistan not once again become a battleground for rival regional and international forces. That means, as I've said, this doesn't just mean resisting Indian influence. It means, preventing Afghanistan itself from doing the things that would encourage India to intervene in Afghanistan in negative ways. It also means absolutely critically not allowing Afghanistan to become a battleground between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Here there is, I'm sorry to say, in Pakistan, a certain legacy of what I would regard as anti-Iranian paranoia, stoked, of course, by Saudi money going to sectarian terrorist groups in Pakistan. It would be viewed, I think, not just very negatively in Tehran, but I believe, given the increasingly close ties between Beijing and Tehran, it would be viewed very negatively indeed in China if Pakistan were to be seen to be going along with or not resisting any kind of Saudi attempt of that kind. And I must say candidly, do not trust the Saudis not to attempt something like that in future, given their own past links to the Taliban and given their pathologically anti-Iranian agendas. So That is another major factor. But on the other hand, ISIS, the Islamic State of Khorasan, horrible though it is, also does provide a certain basis for international cooperation there, given that, because of course of its international jihadi agenda, because of its dreadful attacks of different kinds, because of its links to groups that are hostile to every regional state and the United States and the West. This does provide one basis for an international, if not a coalition, then a community of sentiment when it comes to future developments in Afghanistan. The other thing I would say is that, but once again, there's no need for Pakistan to take the lead on this, but the Taliban have promised every state with which they've been in touch to suppress the heroin trade again in Afghanistan, as they did in 1999 to 2001. They proved in those years that they can do that. That would be colossally to the advantage of the world in general, including Pakistan, but including Iran, including Russia, and Europe. But of course, in order to do that, the Taliban will require money. Fairly enough, they need to compensate their farmers. So whatever Pakistan can do to shape international aid to Pakistan with a specific goal of helping the Taliban to suppress the heroin trade, I think that would be a really great contribution to the re-establishment of Afghanistan as an accepted member of the and respectable member of the international community, and it would serve the interests of Pakistan and indeed the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. Listening to you is always special. And, thanks once again for always cooperating with the Institute for Policy Reforms. I'd now like to invite to the virtual podium General Ashfaq Nadeem Ahmed. General Ashfaq brings to this discussion deep insight gained in a remarkable career of over 40 years with the Pakistan Army. His last military assignment was Chief of General Staff. In senior leadership roles, General Ashfaq Nadeem planned and led a number of critical operations. Foremost among them was Zarb-e-Azam anti-terror operation, which he planned as Director General of Military Operations of the Pakistan Army. For these services, he received the High National Award of Hilal-e-Imtiaz military. General Ashfaq can always be counted upon for his candid views, and as a critical and creative thinker, brings fresh perspectives on any issue at hand. General Ashfaq holds a master's degree in National Resource Strategy from NDU, Washington, D.C., and also a master's degree in War and Strategic Studies from NDU in Islamabad. It is a pleasure to welcome General Ashfaq Nadeem to this online meeting. General Ashfaq.
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful to you as well as to IPR for providing us this opportunity. Quite a few points have already been covered by my worthy colleagues, the two speakers, Ambassador Riaz and Professor Lieven. So I'll try to be brief. Over the last few weeks, things have come to such a pass in Afghanistan that it has become the focus of even greater world attention. Becoming the focus of world attention is not surprising. But what surprised me, and I say that in a lighter vein, is that everyone and their aunt have suddenly become experts on all that is transpiring in Afghanistan. I am no expert myself, but I'll try and list a few issues which may be of concern to the region as well as Pakistan. My fear is that because of shallow and superficial analysis often carried out on the various news channels, it could lead to unwise decisions by some of the what I want to do is to look at how the situation in Afghanistan would unfold hereafter, which is not an easy undertaking. And as Mr. Humayun Saab was saying that we need to look at the next 50 years, I would not like to stick my neck out for saying what it would look like in 50 years, but I can try and do a bit of forecasting with regard to how the situation would evolve in the immediate context. Based on that forecasting, I would talk about the opportunities and challenges for the region in general, but for Pakistan in particular. Various experts have repeatedly been saying that Afghanistan has been a graveyard of empires. America just became the latest of those empires. What is surprising, though, that the entity, i.e. the Taliban, who have added USA to that list, is being demonized, sometimes justly, but often unfairly. Such demonization has not happened when other empires, Britain and USSR, were defeated. While at the time of Britain's or East India Company's defeat in 1841, the Afghans rebelled in answer to the call for jihad, religion did not play as significant a role as it did nearly a century and a half later when the Soviets were defeated. The same holds true for the recent American debacle as well. This handing out of latest defeat is different significantly on two accounts, in my opinion. First, no one in the West is saying that Afghans as a nation defeated the US and other allies. Instead, quote unquote, a non-representative, quote unquote, inhumane, quote unquote, radicalized, regressive, small segment of the Afghan society, i.e. the Taliban, is being held responsible for defeating this empire. This obviously is not totally true. In support of this perception, the fearful scenes out of Kabul are being projected as a result of past and potential Taliban atrocities. While a percentage, and maybe a good percentage, of people are fleeing because out of fear, but in my understanding, there is a large number who are just looking at this as an opportunity to go and settle elsewhere outside Afghanistan. Is it really surprising for any avid Afghan observer to conclude that 3 generations of Afghanistan, having seen only conflict and strife with still no apparent end in sight, would be willing to exploit any and every opportunity, howsoever remote, to make it to a better country for a better life? Consider this: majority of the 3 million Afghan refugees which poured into Pakistan last time around have stayed on and refused to return voluntarily. And Pakistan is no USA, Britain, or Germany in terms of quality of life. Evacuation, therefore, from Afghanistan will not end because there are no more people to evacuate. It will end either when planes stop landing at Kabul or when Taliban decide enough is enough. Let me share with you some information that I have, and I am not 100% sure on this, that there are some in Pakistan who tried or seriously considered moving to Kabul and become a part of that throng to travel abroad and settle outside. So I don't see it extremely or totally surprising at all for the majority of the Afghans, or at least a decent percentage of the Afghans, in trying to do the same. Despite West's 20 years of microscopic attention, economic, military, and diplomatic presence, I am amazed at the lack of understanding of the Afghan culture and mind by quite a few of us. The second reason why this latest defeat of an empire is different, because Taliban's success is perceived to be representative of Islam at large, which post the demise of the Soviet Union has often been projected as a threat to the way of life of the West. So therefore, there's this marked difference between the past Afghan wars and this one. So what this means is that the enemy is back in power, is in control again, and we are back to square one virtually. So unlike at the time of Soviet Union's defeat, there are no celebrations, only a feeling of despondency and anger in the West. It may seem harsh, crass, and unfair when I say that for the Taliban to defeat USA and take back control of Afghanistan was the easier bit. The difficult part, that of governing, starts now. Taliban are good at fighting, not so much at strategic governance. Surviving in government for them would not be easy considering all the challenges. My estimate is that Taliban would be less intense, as has been said by my worthy speakers, colleagues, would be less intense and follow a much lesser radicalized approach compared to the past, but without compromising on the souls, because they cannot distance themselves too much from their propagated version of the religion. If they do, and this is an important point that I want to make, it could lead to potential splintering amongst their ranks. I remember during General Petraeus' time when he was in Afghanistan, we discussed and dissuaded our American friends from attempts at considering splintering the Taliban to achieve victory, because we felt then that it would become even more challenging, and I feel any splintering in the Taliban ranks now would also add to the problems. However, my suspicion is that this splintering would nonetheless likely happen. The level or degree of splintering, however, is difficult to predict. This splintering becomes a possibility also because of Taliban's decision to have a broad-based government, an act which may well be challenged by some within the Taliban, but an act which I agree is a necessary one. Such issues would be exploited by countries which fail to reconcile with the Taliban victory. Such attempts may bear some results in the short term, but would be disastrous for the security of the region and beyond in the long term. Any loss of control by Taliban on its territory could be exploited by terrorist groups against certain countries. It is also important that India quickly reconciles with facts, otherwise Pak-India proxy could potentially start afresh on Afghan soil. I believe it is in the interest of all countries to prod, encourage, and help the Taliban towards formation of a broad-based, inclusive, and relatively moderate government. This is best achieved by engaging the Taliban and assuring them of help and recognition if they were to have an inclusive government with representation of all ethnicities and of women. TTA would also need a lot of help for effective governance post-formation of a reasonable government. If both the Taliban as well as the international community act wisely, there could be relative stability and a longish Taliban tenure. I feel China, Russia, Turkey, Central Asian republics, at least some of them, and Pakistan are likely to be more proactive in engaging and helping the Taliban. USA, I suspect, will have to follow suit by compulsion, if not by choice. The big question now is, do we want the Taliban to succeed in governing Afghanistan? If yes, how? Another important point that I want to make is that people who are deriding USA and blaming them for fall of all military hardware into the Taliban's hands need to realize that if the intra-Afghan dialogue had succeeded, all this equipment would still have been in Taliban's hands, albeit within a broad-based government. Similar broad-based government, if achieved now, would mean the same. The degree of angst and pain, therefore, needs to reduce within the American and NATO camps. Taliban would do well not to disband the Afghan army. Instead, the same army should be reassured, strengthened, and revived with suitable leadership and organizational changes, and be entrusted with the responsibilities any army of a country would be entrusted with. Suitable ethnic representation already exists in the Afghan army, especially in the officers' cadre. Taliban would be well advised not to make a mistake similar to what Mr. Bremer had done with the then Iraqi army. Although I understand there were certain differences, but it was disastrous there, it would be disastrous here. Not all members of the ANA or the Afghan National Army would be willing to serve with Taliban, but most would. This would also help in operationalizing the US weapons on which this Taliban army has trained over the last several years. The Taliban, in my opinion, also need to improve their perception in the eyes of the West, which they already seem to be doing. An event which could give their perception a positive boost would be to cajole some of the Afghan refugees within Pakistan to voluntarily return. Pakistan would be more than willing to help. Obviously a difficult undertaking, but one, if achieved, would bring great credit to Taliban and would bring into question the narrative of people fleeing Afghanistan out of fear. China, it seems, will have a dominant role to play in Afghanistan in the foreseeable future. This would include economic and military support. However, greater the number of Chinese projects, greater would be their vulnerability to forces inimical to Afghanistan's stability and to Chinese presence. This vulnerability may well suck in the Chinese even more for security, safety, protection, etc. If not handled wisely by both countries, China may end up as being the next great empire to truly experience Afghanistan. This possibility, however, is both remote and distant for now. Despite needing it, it will be difficult for the Taliban to seek major active military help from another country so soon after dispatching USA and NATO. Obviously, there is a world of difference between the Taliban requesting military help compared to a forced foreign entry leading to occupation. Nonetheless, it would be difficult for them to seek military help, at least in the immediate future. I do, however, expect presence of some foreign military advisors, possibly from China, sooner or later. Pakistan would also be willing to help, but would like to keep the signature light, at least initially. An immediate concern, obviously, for the Taliban would be the provision of security, especially after the Kabul airport bombings. Having been behind most bombings over the last 2 decades, the Taliban suddenly find themselves in preventing others, i.e. Daesh, from doing the same to them. And it is obviously important to understand that carrying out a bombing is easier compared to preventing one. Provision of security would therefore be critical to enhance confidence of the international community as well as the Afghani public and prevent mass exodus. The drone strike in Nangarhar province on the planner of the recent bombing at Kabul airport carried out by American drone Reaper. I am not sure whether it was done in coordination with the Taliban or with their knowledge. I am not too sure. but eventually this is an area which will come to light and which could bring into challenge the relations, howsoever limited, between USA and Taliban. The current situation affords obviously some opportunities for Pakistan in various spheres. Politically, Pakistan remains relevant for pursuing the Taliban to agree to a broad-based government. A joint approach in this regard, I feel, by China, Pakistan, and Turkey may be more fruitful. The broader the base of the government, the greater would be the possibility of stability and sustainability, as has already been mentioned by other speakers. Unfortunate as it is, Pakistan will continue to be seen through the Afghan prism by the United States for now. However, Pakistan should look at this as an opportunity to improve relations with the USA by helping her in reducing the impact of the fallout of President Biden's ill-considered decision. Any leverages and flexibility obtained by Pakistan from Taliban, which is helpful to the United States, would be beneficial for Pak-US relations. For example, if Taliban agreed to a broad-based government, inclusion of women, empowering of ANA, provision of some commercial projects to the Western countries in addition to China, etc., this would actually help in Pakistan-US relations. Despite Pakistan's long-standing desire for the US to carry out a conditions-based withdrawal, Pakistan will have to continue to support US having done exactly the opposite by their rather sudden withdrawal. USA, in my opinion, would be well advised to maintain a degree of leverage over Taliban. This can be achieved if US is willing to engage and help them through political, diplomatic, and financial support. Financial support would be critical because the Afghans are too poor to be taxed to generate money for themselves. Also, policing the inaccessible territories of Afghanistan against Daesh or other potential terrorist groups also warrants or needs resources which the Taliban would probably not have. There is a huge economic opportunity for Pakistan, and I agree with Ambassador Riaz and Professor Lieven that it will have to wait for now based on how Afghanistan stabilizes over the next few months. But there are opportunities with regard to mineral resources as well as those of oil and gas. There is also the possibility of an oil pipeline from Pakistan extending into Afghanistan. The current challenge, however, would be that Taliban may not have the finances to support such an arrangement. Relative stability in Afghanistan would also open up trade opportunities, as has already been said, in Central Asian republics, and this could also encourage India to improve its relations with Pakistan, and any improvement in Indo-Pak relations would enhance or contribute, in my opinion, to the stability of Afghanistan. There do exist a few challenges, briefly, for Pakistan. With a resurgent Daesh along its borders, Pakistan will be faced with the real possibility of terrorist action inside Pakistan. The much trumpeted fence along the Pak-Afghan border cannot totally prevent crossings by miscreants. Then again, these unfrequented crossings would be needed by miscreants only if there was greater and effective control by Pakistan along the nominated border crossings. There is a lot of recent Afghan influx into Pakistan, especially from the Spin Baldak crossing, and there is no way of knowing who all miscreants are among the daily border crosses. Pakistan, obviously, in my opinion, is not up to speed. No camps have been established. Ideally, these should have been established, in my opinion, on the Afghan side for the refugees, with Pakistan taking responsibility for providing logistics, etc., from the Pakistani side, because all these refugees coming into Pakistan, Pakistan would not be able to handle them economically and security-wise. While there are clear signs of TTA willing to dissuade TTP elements from using Afghan territory against Pakistan, the possibility of TTP merging into Daesh for operations on Pakistani soil cannot be ruled out, as has been alluded to by Professor Lieven already. Recruitment from Pakistani border areas is a possibility. The administration of the newly merged FATA would come under duress, the provincial government in Peshawar, that is. It is critically important for Pakistan that the Daesh threat in Afghanistan is quickly brought under effective control. There will be clamor within Pakistan to revive the National Action Plan, some of you may recall, which was formed after the APS attack in Peshawar. Madrasas would come under renewed scrutiny. In case of more attacks against American military or their allies, there could be greater pressure on Pakistan to provide operational bases and more logistic support to USA for its revenge targeting of Daesh and others. Yesterday's targeting of the Daesh planner of the Kabul airport bombing by the US drone in Nangarhar province is ominous for Pakistan because of the province's contiguity to Pakistan itself. The debacle in Afghanistan will have a lasting impact not only on President Biden's presidency, but also on US foreign policy, especially its desire for military interventions, which will reduce. And as was said, that having fought a one-year war 20 times, the strategists, especially those of the military, have to go back to the basics to develop a more efficient system of fighting in foreign lands. The morale of the US troops, as of the entire nation, would also have been affected and would need a recovery period as well, a favorable event. It will soon become USA's compulsion to financially help the TTA government and its various organizations, including the Afghan National Army. Absence of financial support by developed countries could add to the strife with Taliban losing control over parts of the country, resulting in use of the same by other terrorist groups against Taliban within Afghanistan as well as outside. If this happens, all the sufferings and deaths and all the blood and treasure cost would come to naught, signaling, in my opinion, the possible end of Biden presidency. The success of the Taliban also, lastly, may embolden other groups, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, despite they being aligned to the Shia version of Islam, but these and similar groups can be or would be emboldened. This could cause further deterioration in stability of several countries in the Middle East and Africa. To conclude, militarily, in my opinion, winning the control would in hindsight seem easier. Control of Afghanistan in hindsight would seem easier when it is compared to governing this kingdom of Khorasan. Thank you.
Thank you, General Ashfaq. As usual, a well-informed and elusive presentation. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to open this virtual meeting to questions. I'd like to request all participants to use the raise hand feature. It will be noted, and I will call then the questioners. We will take a number of questions, half a dozen or so, and then I will ask the speakers to respond to them as they. I mean, some question may be addressed to a particular speaker, but if not, then whichever speaker thinks that they wish to answer the question, please feel free. Right now, I have three participants who have expressed a desire to question. I would appreciate if don't ask too many questions in one attempt, one or two, and be specific, and if possible, identify the speaker you wish the question to be answered by. The first on my list is Talat Masood. After that, Mr. Ansar Shamsi, and the third would be Tariq Ikram. So, General Talat Masood,
My question is that, it has been mentioned that, they should, the army or the government must, the present government in Afghanistan, which is the Taliban, they should balance this. Um, so, when you say that you are going to be more moderate as far as the Taliban are concerned, then by doing so, uh, what will be the reaction within the Taliban group? Will they split, or will they take it as something which has been ordered by their superiors and they will have to obey it? Because, the whole concept and the whole ideology of Taliban is such that it is quite possible that there would be some form of a reaction. So, are we prepared? Is the Afghan government prepared for that, or international prepared for that? Then so my question is that who will pay for the Afghan army, and will it not create problems with the Taliban fighters, and to have a sort of a parallel army, which would be perhaps doing something similar to what they were supposed to be doing, which is defending the country or performing acts which the government of Afghanistan now would desire them to, conduct. So I think there are some contradictions as far as this is concerned.
thank you, General Talat. Well, that's happening. Let's see if Tariq Ikram is available.
Gee, thank you very much, Mayu. It is always a pleasure to be listening and learning from such interactions. My brief and succinct recommendation and question, both in one, arises out of what Ambassador Riaz very rightly said, that discreet diplomacy and discreet support and humanitarian assistance is required. Dr. Anatol said Pakistan has strong interest in Afghan economic development. Afghans need money, he also said. And as I see it, that Afghanistan at the moment needs all goods and services that it can think of. And there are restrictions, and there will be restrictions. Secondly, they need to keep the inflation down. Thirdly, they have at the moment very limited foreign exchange. And fourthly, that they need, that Pakistan needs to win the minds and hearts of the Afghanis, especially in the context of the past Indian influence in Afghanistan. So my suggestion and question also is that would it be useful for us to immediately allow duty-free import of all goods from Afghanistan, duty-free export of all goods of Pakistan, and transactions in rupees, because that will help them in making sure that goods are available at the lowest possible price. Secondly, that they can earn foreign exchange. And thirdly, that it wins us goodwill. So the question is really for any participant, any of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. Is Mr. Ansar Shamsi available?
Yes, sir. I can hear you. Well, this is, what Mr. Tariq Ikram has said. This is just to further highlight that there is a situation of economic meltdown already in Afghanistan. Whereas, the suggestions he has given to open up the trade are very valid. I think the international community should release, particularly the United States, the funds that have been freezed. Having said that, I think another important thing is the recognition of the new government which is in the making in Afghanistan, and to stabilize the situation. I think I have an idea that within the fourfold and suprastructure of emirate, if the Taliban body politic at large can consider declaring themselves as an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan rather than an emirate, probably the acceptability at the national level will be easier. I would like the speakers to comment on this, and later on, I think, given all the consensus on this issue, maybe a Marshall Plan kind of thing can be worked out for Afghanistan to rebuild this country, including China, Russia, and the West and the Bretton Woods institutes were still in vogue. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shamsi Saab. Next is Sayyid Rizvi.
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Humayun Akhtar's absolutely correct assessment that it's a cyclical process of 40 years, and it brought to memory the king and then what had followed. My question, I have 2 or 3 questions. My first question is to Professor Anatol, and I'm asking him that is it possible to run the Afghanistan as we see now, without the devolution of power from the centralized government in Kabul, and without devolving power to the regions and sub-regions? And another question is that can Afghanistan be ever united due to its polarized natural state of Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Pashtuns? Can it ever be a united country? And to General Tariq, I have only one question. Do we have any example where a population armed to the teeth, and especially in case of Afghanistan, not educated, unless they are disarmed, peace can return to it? Thank you.
Thank you, Rizvi Saab. Next is Mr. Hossain Naki. Mr.
Yes.
Hossain Naki.
I think the first priority in Afghanistan is the formation of a government that is acceptable to the world community. I think that should be the top priority. And subsequently, as Mr. Riaz Muhammad Khan and General Ashfaq Nadeem have both mentioned that some sort of Pakistan-India rapprochement about Afghanistan and about between themselves is also a priority for Afghanistan's for our participation in Afghanistan. I think these 2 are to be answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Naki Saab. Next is Senator Faratullah Babar. Senator Faratullah Babar, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Humayun Akhtar Khan Sahab. I don't really have a specific question, but I have just 2 observations, and from those observations will also emerge questions. So I would urge any one of the distinguished panelists to kindly respond to that, whatever question he might think arises from my observation. My first observation is that Pakistan is being largely viewed as having supported one faction in Afghanistan at the expense of all other factions in that country. And this is generally the view and the belief also. Let us not live in a state of denial. So my observation is that in the next 10 years or 15 years, the future generations in Afghanistan are likely to believe that Pakistan is their enemy and that Pakistan brought upon them this misfortune. This is my one observation. And a short while ago, General Ashfaq Nadeem also referred to the Houthis gaining strength in Yemen as a result of the Tehreek Taliban Afghanistan gaining power in Afghanistan. And in Houthis, in Yemen also, we know that the Islamic Military Alliance, which is headed by a Pakistani general, it has also given serious questions that Pakistan is also being viewed in Yemen as one of the countries which has brought upon them the misfortune. The second observation that I want to make is that in November 2020, when the Doha talks were going on, the United States suddenly lifted sanctions and restrictions on the ETIM in Xinjiang. Nobody knew why. It was done very quietly, but it was announced. China expressed serious reservations. Pakistan remained quiet. Now, that was the time when the United States was taking measures to recognize Taliban, legitimize Taliban, and delegitimize the Afghan government of that time. So, what I can see, what I can visualize is that perhaps the Taliban and the Daesh and the militants will eventually be allowed to destabilize China through the ETIM in Xinjiang. And if that happens, or if that begins, then Pakistan will be in serious trouble. So my question, any question that arises from these two is whether Pakistan-Afghan relations the next 10, 15 years, or will be that based on the assumption that Afghanistan considers Pakistan as friend, or whether Afghanistan will consider Pakistan as its foremost enemy. And second question is, of course, that, the likelihood of the Taliban being used by the US against China in the renewed Cold War and against the CPEC, etc. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Senator Baba. Fazle Tivana.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sir, thank you very much for offering this opportunity. It's a great pleasure. My question is that to all the panelists, that does this situation in Afghanistan not provide a golden opportunity to Pakistan to send an army of qualified civilians who can participate in Operation GGA? This is a term which I have coined, which means Operation Good Governance in Afghanistan. This shall be based upon clear-cut agreements guaranteeing safety, accommodation, financial costs, funded, of course, by international financial agencies and supporting governments. If this happens, I believe we will have a strong position in bringing about stability, peace, and progress in Afghanistan. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, we have 7 questioners, and I would now request the speakers to try and answer them in the same order that they spoke. So, Ambassador Riaz Mahmoud Khan, and then Dr. Anatol Lieven, and then General Ashfaq Nadeem. So, Ambassador Riaz, would you like to crack at some of the questions?
May I intervene for a second, please? Ambassador Coker wants to ask a question. Ambassador Riaz Coker.
There'll be more, but
all right.
Yeah, he can ask now, but I was going to come back. So please go ahead, Ambassador Coker.
Thank you, Mayusab, very kind of you. My question was partially asked by Mr. Faratullah Baba, but my specific question is to General Ashfaq Nadeem. Of course, I have not had the pleasure of meeting him. I know of his great professional ability. Why is it that Pakistan is being blamed by virtually by the entire West about its involvement with the Taliban? What is the nature? What has been the nature of our relationship with them? Number one. And how do we deal with this terrible narrative? Because this is going to snowball. When you say that we should deal about this matter diplomatically, that's not good enough. We don't really have a solid narrative. So maybe, General Saab, you can suggest some ideas to us. Thank you.
Okay, depending on the time available to the speakers, we may ask more questions. But right now, I'd like to request the speakers, starting with Ambassador Riaz, to have a crack at the questions that have been asked so far. Ambassador Riaz.
Well, thank you very much, Himayu Khan Saab. I think these are very important questions which have been raised, and there are so many of them, I can't even keep tab of
Well,
them.
just have a
But
crack at the ones you want to answer.
I will just address one very important question by Senator Farhatullah Babar Sahib. He has raised some very, very deep and important issues. I have always said that Pakistan's policy somehow or the other kept slipping into the ethnic divide in Afghanistan, all that. But one specific thing that he has mentioned about is this ETIM and all that. Whatever little I know, now I am out of government for a long time, I know we are extremely careful that we do not ruffle feathers with China. China is a very basic relationship for us for a variety of reasons. So I hope that we will never ever make a mistake of trying to play that kind of a game over here. Secondly, when towards the end of whatever I had to say, I was talking about that we should have a rethink about our regional role. In that rethink, all this that we have done over the years, you know, the sort of support for this faction or that faction, or trying to, I would not call interfere, but certainly this is how the perception had developed. We have to look at this, and we have to basically look at the economic opportunities for the region that hopefully, if the situation starts stabilizing, may open up. And I think already this year onwards, from beginning of this year onward, there has been thinking at the highest levels in Pakistan about that whole issue. So this is what I would like to say to Farhatullah Babar Saab. Otherwise, as I said, that he has really raised very, very fundamental questions on which we have to do introspection as a whole.
Dr. Lieven, would you like to add?
And why I have Dr. Lieven has mentioned about some kind of a trade arrangement, and I had lost him during that period. If he can just with 2 words explain what was the arrangement that he was talking about.
Well, Dr. Lieven, would you like to have a crack at some of the questions, including one asked by Ambassador Riaz?
Yes, I mean, what I was referring to was the fact that if China can be brought to invest heavily in Afghanistan, which would depend, of course, on internal peace and stability in Afghanistan, then the resulting closer economic and infrastructural relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the export of, for example, Afghan copper via Pakistan would help to tie Pakistan and Afghanistan more closely together economically, without the need for the kind of interference and manipulation which Riaz Saab has said has led to negative results in the past, with which I completely agree with him. I would also like to endorse the view of, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said this, but one member of the audience said that it would be good if Pakistan were to help the new government in Afghanistan by agreeing to free trade, to completely open Afghan exports and imports via Pakistan. I think that would be a very good start. In general, of course, yes, I mean, anything that Pakistan can do to help Afghanistan economically would be advantageous for everybody, for the entire world. One speaker talked about, the mobilizing a sort of Pakistani Marshall Plan with international aid to help Afghanistan, with many Pakistanis going to work there. Forgive me for saying this, but there are parts of Pakistan which also need this very, very badly. Perhaps one should start, inside Pakistan with such projects on a larger scale. But of course, helping Afghanistan is very good as well. devolution of power in Afghanistan. All of modern Afghan history, unfortunately, including under the Americans and their regime in Afghanistan, has been a history of attempted centralization in theory. And of course, this is because every Afghan government and state has feared dissolution because of, as the speaker said, this extremely divided Afghan society. I doubt myself that from all my conversations with them, that the Taliban would break with this practice in principle of centralized power. But then, as we've so often seen in Afghanistan, including under the latest state, tremendous centralization in theory can go along with a great deal of devolution in practice. And certainly if the Taliban carry through or fulfill their promises to Ismail Khan, to the Hazaras, to others, about including them in power, that would bring with it a considerable degree of de facto devolution of power to the regions. But we'll have to see. I mean, this is a considerable test. Certainly, I think Afghanistan would be a much happier place and more stable place if there were greater devolution. I entirely agree with you there. That, I think, is about all I have to say, except just to echo two things that General Ashfaq and Riaz Mohammed Khan said. The first, since I'm the only Westerner on the panel, I would also like to say that however one might dislike many aspects of their ideology, it is impossible not to feel admiration for the courage and the resilience that the Taliban have shown over the past 20 years in the face of extraordinary odds and extraordinary sacrifices. That it's that above all, I think, which gives them this legitimacy in much of the Afghan population, which I hope will be the basis for stable government in Afghanistan, if these qualities of courage and resilience can now be combined with pragmatism, and an understanding of modern development and an understanding of how the outside world works. I've been telling my colleagues in the West that Mullah Barada's long stay in Pakistan hopefully led him to a greater understanding of how the world works and modern development issues. All I can say is that I hope Pakistan used Mullah Barada's enforced stay in Pakistan to to persuade him of these things. The other thing that I'm afraid I have to echo General Ashfaq in is I myself have been appalled by the quality of much of the Western reporting and analysis of Afghanistan in recent weeks, and that's also because I think the General talked about America having been in Afghanistan as it was in Vietnam, not 20 years or 15 years, but 20 times 1 year. It just did not build up the kind of cadres of really knowledgeable people about Afghanistan, or I may add Pakistan. And that, reflects the fact that the modern West is simply incapable of running a successful, neo-colonial program of, building puppet states. It just can't. It doesn't have the people, it doesn't have the structures, it doesn't have the will, which helps to give me confidence that the West is not going to try and do this again. Admittedly, I suppose everyone said that after Vietnam, and then 26 years later, America did it again. But the West has failed totally in Afghanistan, and I hope Riaz Saab has said that Pakistan needs to look very, very seriously into Pakistani policy over the past 2 generations and where it went wrong. I think the West also needs to look seriously, at itself, but to draw only one conclusion, which is that it must never try to do this again. Thank you.
General Ashfaq, would you like to
Thank you, sir.
attempt to answer some of the questions, please?
Yeah. Yes, I'll do that. I'll start with what General Talat had asked or said, commented about splintering. Good to see you, General Talat, sir. I just want to say that the challenge right now is that these things which are being said are easier said than done. With regard to a moderate form of government, with regard to an all-inclusive government, because it is a challenge, as I mentioned in my remarks, that some rank and file within the Taliban would potentially or possibly be opposed to it. So what the world should be doing is not asking Taliban to do what the world feels that the type of government should be, but there has to be a balance which has to be struck between what, as I said, the soul of the Taliban movement was and is, and what the expectation is from the world at large. So this balance has to be achieved. If there is greater pushing or stressing or forcing of the Taliban with regard in a particular direction, which does not sit well with the Taliban leadership, or even if it does with the leadership, it does not sit well with the rank and file, we'll end up actually creating a lot of strife in Afghanistan. With regard to the army, Taliban seem to be, if they want to be inclusive, I think the quickest and the best way, in addition to bringing a broad-based political setup, is also with regard to having the existing army, which was meant to defend Afghanistan in the first place, to bring it into its fold. Otherwise, it would not be possible for 65,000 Taliban to provide you the security which is based, for which they have given assurances that their territory would not be used by terrorists to attack any other country. It will not be possible for them to live up to that assurance. And therefore, there will be additional requirements. So there are 350,000 people who are trained. It is not just the Afghan National Army, it is also the police. It is the local police and so on. And therefore, it will be extremely difficult without them. They are trained, and if they divide and go into their respective tribes, and there is a civil war, if it begins to happen, so it will be disastrous. With regard to a fund, yes, I agree that a fund may have to be, there was a question with regard to a fund. I think a fund has to be created, and you could call it whatever, by Friends of Afghanistan, as was said earlier some years back. So that also needs to be looked at, because without finances, I don't think the Afghans would be able to do anything. Senator Faratullah Babar, I think that I agree that the points that he has raised are extremely significant. Pakistan is, yes, viewed having supported one faction. I am not saying that Pakistan, and I will link what Ambassador Khokhar has asked me, although the response to Ambassador Khokhar's question would be fairly lengthy, because it's will be a complicated answer. So I don't want to narrate everything right now, because in the interest of time, I can come visit him and discuss that. But just broadly, Taliban, in my opinion, would have won regardless. I mean, if theoretically speaking, if there was no border here between Afghanistan and Pakistan, theoretically speaking, if Pakistan was not there, Taliban would still have won, in my opinion. They may have taken 2 or 3 more years, but they still would have won. For any insurgency, which this was an insurgency against the Americans and everybody in Afghanistan by the Taliban, to succeed, there has to be a base outside the country or the territory in which insurgency is being carried out. So there was a very good study, I believe, carried out by RAND, in which almost 95% of the insurgencies which succeeded depended, in their conclusions, on having an area outside the country of immediate interest. Taliban were created, as you know, Pakistan supported them in the last time when they captured Kabul and Afghanistan, and they were created. They were a creation by themselves, but Pakistan obviously supported them. There are 3 million Afghan refugees here, and Pakistan was obviously connected to them. Mullah Brother was arrested or captured with the help of CIA in Karachi, and the Americans, I am aware of this, had always been encouraging Pakistan to remain engaged with the Taliban for one reason or the other. And without going now into further details, because it would take a lot of time. So what I'm saying is that yes, there was a degree of support which became a compulsion with regard to their leadership being here, with regard to lots of their families and people living here. Even if they were not here, their families were here. And they continued. If you tried and stopped Afghans from coming into Pakistan for medical treatment and all, it would have become a challenge. And I say that Pakistan's policies with regard to Afghanistan have been a disaster, whether they have been governments by the military governments or the civilian governments, because the landlord country depending totally on Pakistan for everything. And if they do not have good relations with Pakistan, there's something wrong with the Pakistani policy. And therefore, we need to look at the policies ourselves that we actually have been following with regard to this. Pak-India rapprochement, by Mr. Naqi had said, yes, there has to be, if there is a rapprochement between Pakistan and India, it will help Afghanistan. And there are a couple of questions which I think I'm missing, but if you still want to come back to me, it will be a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General Ashfaq. Now we are approaching 2 hours of this virtual meeting, and that's usually our limit, and that's the kind of request we make to the speakers. So they're all busy people, they have time constraints. So unfortunately, we will not be able to take, there are a lot of more questions, but we won't be able to take them. I'll just make some concluding remarks, and from what I've heard from the speakers and from the questioners, I think that the Troika Plus, which has been created, which is the United States, China, Russia, and I think the plus is Pakistan, should play a very critical role in the formation of the next government in Afghanistan. The world is now watching. We all believe that Afghanistan will need help. They just don't have the economy which can sustain the country or me that we are talking about. Obviously, it was mentioned that you can tax those people. They're not capable of paying any tax. So the Taliban have to cooperate. The world is watching them. They have to establish, the Taliban and the rest of the world have to establish their credibility with each other. That, I think, is very important. The second comment I want to make is, look, we're talking of peace in the region, and of course, the current focus is on Afghanistan, and an important focus. But if you want peace in the region, you have to have, Pakistan has to have peace with India. And the last thing India should do is, and the last thing the Taliban should do is let their soil be used for against India or for against any country for that matter. So I think sometime down the future, Pakistan has to think very, very seriously if they want to achieve peace finally in this region. And of course, it also depends on India as to what their ambitions and objectives are. There was reference to Vietnam, but this is something that Anatol might be interested in. I think there's a fundamental difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan. Vietnam generated a movement, not only in the United States, but international movement against the US's presence in Vietnam. But despite this being the longest war for not only America but the rest of NATO, there is no such movement internationally. Okay, and in fact there is very little interest in the United States, and I think that probably is the reason that President Biden took the steps that he took, because I personally feel that this will quite soon, quite rapidly disappear. I mean, if there are no further debacle, then of course this attack was very tragic, and let's see what the terrorist organizations can do further damage. The third comment is that I don't know how homogeneous that this new Taliban setup is. I mean, I think that it'll be a challenge to keep the Taliban together. There are people within the Taliban of all kinds of thinking, and I think the Taliban leadership would have to keep a very good balance of pragmatism and of not letting too many of the Taliban's move towards more violent organizations like ISIS-K and these kinds of organizations. I think it'll be very good that that's one good thing that the Taliban did last time around. They finished the heroin trade in that region, and I hope that continues, but it will really depend in the world coming together and trying to help the Afghans, not only the Taliban. Of course, the world has to help the Afghans also to recover from this very vicious 50-year, half a century cycle that hopefully is coming to an end. And we're hoping that the new one, if indeed it is going to be a next half a century cycle, it would be somewhat better than the last one. I would just say, in the end, it's in the interest of everybody. My last comment, that a new superpower game should be avoided in this region, and that depends on the regional powers as well as Afghanistan. That they should try and keep a balance with respect to their relationships, not only with Russia, China, Iran, even India, but with the West. They should try and keep a balance. If you close the doors on any power, then, I mean, we all know that in this era of electric vehicles and electric, the direction in which the legislation in the world is moving, I mean, Afghanistan is very lithium rich. So a lot of countries would be interested, and lithium is the battery, which is the one which will extensively be used in electric vehicles. So my view right now, as not an expert, but as a policymaker, would be that there should be a balance. I mean, no part of the world or no country should be left out from this region. I wish to really thank the very illustrious speakers and our participants who always take a very keen interest in our webinars. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation.